I'm sorry. Did I talk about AI for less than 2 minutes? Let me fix that. I have to get this off of my chest. I've spent quite a few videos at this point ranting about AI, and I start to see a trend of the way that I talk about it. And I just get super passionate about it. I find the whole thing so interesting. I think we're at one of the most important curvatures and transitions in technology, culture, business, economics, and it's all converging at the same time right now. And so for me, and from my perspective, whether it's the kind of vacuum chamber that I live in, or the way that I consume my media, or my culture, or the world around me, I feel like it is deafening, and all I can do is think about it. And I kind of enjoy doing nothing but thinking about it, quite frankly. I've gone through times where it gets fatiguing, but I get myself so full of things to say about it, but the people around me, I just love too much to info dump on them all the time, which is why I have this channel, and it is an outlet for me. Let's start with XAI. Like I said, SpaceX went public on Friday with their initial public offering, and they were looking for a $2 trillion market cap, and they basically achieved it. What is so troublesome to me is not SpaceX as the company that I think people think of, which is rockets. It is the XAI aspect to it. That is most of what the company is that you are investing in. That is the big percentage of what SpaceX is, at least the important percentage in my view, economically. Elon Musk bought Twitter, and he bought it with a bunch of investors who accumulated shares of X. That valuation of Twitter has now dropped to about half of its original value. So there's a lot of debt that he owes to these investors that he could not pay back. So then he merged it with XAI because AI was the hot new thing, and he happened to have an AI company, and it became XAI. The whole thing was bundled together, and that was done with more investors. There was no money actually changing hands, just more people getting XAI stock. Then there still was this debt problem, and he had a rather successful space company, SpaceX, which is NASA rockets, but mainly also, and very importantly, Starlink, which I think has been the most successful venture of Elon's career, at least the most notable in terms of recent years. And so he tagged SpaceX on to XAI. They all became one company, SpaceX. Again, no money changed hands, just more investors, more people taking SpaceX stock. But unless you're a public company and you have the amount of debt that SpaceX has accumulated, you have no way to pay these people off. It's also important to note that XAI is an absolute, like all these other AI companies, an absolute cash burner. They are burning billions of dollars a year. It is the definition of an unprofitable business model, the definition of an unprofitable company. And I want to come back to that in a little bit, but I have to just stay on SpaceX for a minute. These investors need to get paid out because they have lots and lots of shares and lots of money invested in a company that has no strategy to ever turning a profit, at least not the larger SpaceX. Again, not talking about the rocket part of SpaceX or the Starlink part of SpaceX, SpaceX as a whole, which you have to remember, it's mostly XAI that they are invested in. So the only way for them to turn those stocks into cash is to go public with the company and turn it over to retail investors where people start giving them money and they can sell off that stock in exchange for tangible cash. Now, here's the scuttlebutt that everybody I think is a little bit either upset or in my view, glossing over, which is that I'm getting all the names confused. SpaceX went public and they are going to be listed on the NASDAQ 100 index. Now, these indexes are what all of your 401k, all of your basic investments are wrapped up into. Everybody's got something in an index, and those indexes are compiled of huge companies, Walmart, Intel, Nvidia, these non-finance companies. And so usually the reason why NASDAQ is such a reputable index to put money into is because it is founded on these very big, very stable, often and most of the time, very successful companies for one reason or another, whether or not they're turning profit or not is not super relevant. It's just how stable are they as a company. In order to earn that right to be in the NASDAQ 100, one of the very important rules that the NASDAQ has is to give what they call a seasoning period to that stock. That allows them to see after the initial public offering to make sure that this stock doesn't just crash into the ground, and to make sure it's like a stable, a company that has like a game plan and people believe in, and isn't going to crash to the ground. Well, SpaceX is getting initiated into that NASDAQ index without that seasoning period. And there's a lot of correlation between Elon Musk's, his, whether or not you want to believe into the politics, whatever, but for the sake of it, he invested, $300 million into Donald Trump's presidency. And I think that investment is paying off, because I see, and not just me, I mean, I'm hearing this, you're hearing the regurgitation of podcasts and things that I've listened to by people who are much smarter than me. So I'm not claiming to have come up with all of this on my own. But I see, and others see, this SpaceX offering as a bit of a rug pull. Like I said yesterday, a rug pull. I think that potentially investors in SpaceX are pumping up this stock. They are taking an initial public offering. I think there's been a lot of fervor around it to make it seem like this big, huge, hyped investment. And so for them to come out with 3 times the largest IPO in history, I see that as an opportunity for them to cash out. And whether or not the stock crashes is I guess, up to time. I mean, time will tell. No one can predict it. But I think that because it's tied to mostly AI finances and AI business model, I don't see it being I don't see it being a value stock. Now, you can make that argument for Tesla. Tesla has often been viewed as being an overvalued stock. But they make a physical product that can actually sell. And this is where I'm going to converge now. This is where I'm going to lean more into the AI rant, which is that artificial intelligence in these companies, whether it's SpaceX, OpenAI, or Claude, Google Gemini, I think what I struggle to articulate for the sake of my own argument and 2 people that I talk to is having them grasp and understand how subsidized the AI is that you are using. It is so expensive to run these models that even if you pay these companies a monthly subscription, even if your enterprise pays these companies a monthly subscription, they are still paying the highly, highly, highly subsidized price. Now, Uber did this in the beginning. You might remember when you first started with Uber, a trip down the road was like $5. Well, that was because they were getting people bought into the service. And this is part of the enshittification model that has become so popular, where first you make the service super, super attractive to the user. The users all have buy-in, collective buy-in. I use Uber, you use Uber. They take over market share. This happened with Netflix. Everyone started using Netflix. Blockbuster fell off the face of the earth. You do market disruption. And then once you have that market disruption, you jack the prices up. So that's why Uber now is like $80 for what used to be a $5 or $10 ride. Now, the reason that you can't go to another competitor is because there are no competitors. There's really no more taxis in most cities for you to go to. So you are forced to pay that Uber $80 charge. That is smart business. It may be unethical, but that is aggressive, smart capitalism. Now, here's the issue with artificial intelligence or AI models, the current LLMs that we have, and with OpenAI, Claude, Gemini, all those companies I just mentioned. The equivalent would be going from your $10 Uber ride to your $3,000 Uber ride. Right? It's just cost prohibitive. And that's why these companies are now looking to go to the public market, because Claude and OpenAI, they've burned up all their capital investment. All those investors who invest in, they're just turning that around and subsidizing the massive costs that it costs to fulfill these tokens. And these tokens are what that's the kind of technical, we'll call it energy term for this compute, for this data to give you your ChatGPT, your LLM experience. So companies like Claude have now switched from trying to ease people in from this, okay, you pay, let's just say $30 a month and you can have unlimited tokens. So you use Claude all the time and you're like, I see the value in this. My company sees the value in this. But then they have switched their model to now you pay per token. Well, you've likely never paid per token while using our AI models. because if you start to pay per token, you are no longer getting the subsidized price. I mean, well, you still are, but you're getting a much less subsidized price, or they're trying to test the waters of like seeing people's, pain tolerance on the cost of this. And let's go back to Uber, because they recently showed that they were paying per token, and they burned through their token budget for the whole year in 4 months. And they had this moment of like, wait, this might not be something that we can pay for. So what I'm getting at is that these large language models and these companies, these AI companies, I think when they actually start to have to ask for the consumer to get a return on their investment, the consumer is just straight up not going to be able to afford it. Now, the technical side of things, there's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts. There's a lot of give it more three more years. People have argued that there is a higher, token, the inference cost. So like the amount of tokens that they can produce for the amount of energy, that's improving, that the models will improve. I actually don't think that's true. I think that AI for this whole journey that we've been on thus far has always been what it will do, just wait, what's going to happen. And that has been the conversation for the entire time. And most of the things, the very important things that people have come up with, or have relied with those ifs, ands, and buts on, just have not come to fruition. I don't think that companies really are seeing this replacing people. I think lots of companies have tried. I think lots of companies have used that excuse as an excuse to downsize in a tough economy in order to stave off investor panic because they're downsizing, so that must be bad. No, they say we're downsizing because AI is doing all the jobs. I just don't personally buy that story. I have been an avid user at this point, or a regular user of all AI that I can possibly reasonably do, both in my life personally and professionally. And I have a very complicated answer with the technology of whether or not I think it's great. I do think it's great. I think it's one of the most impressive technologies of my generation, of my lifetime. That is for certain. I mean, it's an incredibly impressive piece of technology. But I just don't think it's everything that people have said, and by people I really mean everything culturally that we've seen about like AI is coming for your jobs. AI can do this. AI is dangerous. Look out. It's destroying the planet. Those have all been sort of marketing tactics for these companies to just hype up this thing that they need a constant, huge, unprecedented stream of capital investment in order to keep afloat long enough to hopefully either see the technology improve so much that the profit is just obvious, or long enough for them to go public and jump ship. That's sort of the two routes that I think that they're faced with at this point. And I don't see the technological explosion happening. I mean, we've been told this would be exponential for 3 years, and it's gotten better, and it's gotten a lot more impressive. Just caveat, we're talking about generative AI. I mean, there's lots of artificial technology fields, but I'm talking about the consumer kind of enterprise generative AI. I just don't see the exponential thing happening. In fact, I see it almost reaching some sort of a bottleneck, and you see the talking points like, Claude recently was like, oh, we have this new model that it's so powerful and so intelligent that we can't in good conscience release it to the market. That has such my girlfriend goes to another school energy. It's insane. I just don't buy it. I just see it as desperation. So I do see a collapse. I've said that from the start. I'm not the only one saying it. I think everybody at this point is calling AI a bubble. I think that's an easier argument now to make culturally with people than it has been even 2 years ago. I think there were a lot more AI boosters on the scene, but I think you pair that with people being kind of forced to use it at work, the clunkiness that it has been integrated into our just general internet experience. It's kind of been shoved down our throats as these big companies who thought we had to get on board with this are now realizing that we just can't get consumers to use it the way that we thought they would. And also, the biggest part is the sustainability. I mean, like global warming aside, because I know that's a big trigger word for people, but global warming aside, the resource demand of this is just astronomical. And I think, I've seen people talk about how, like, probably one of the key things that we're going to see before this AI bubble pops, if it does, I mean, and I think it will, how extravagant that pop will be, I think at this point is very unclear. I think the IPO for SpaceX is going to be somewhat of a telling, not of a big pop explosion, but just to illustrate like how many levers financially and politically and legislation are going to be pulled to bring it down to as much of a soft landing as possible. But I think one of the first things that we will see if this does really conclude is a lot of these data centers come to a halt. So much of this market has been so secretive, but I think that's coming to an end as SpaceX just passed it, OpenAI and Claude, or Anthropic, excuse me, are approaching their IPO moment. And they're going to have to spell out exactly what all the financials of this look like. And I think it's going to be a bit of a train wreck. That being said, here's the silver lining that I am beginning to see with the adoption and the rollout of artificial intelligence. And I think that Apple's very recent WWDC showing was a telling of it. Now, Apple is going through a CEO change. So their WWDC, their Worldwide Developers Conference, which is all about Apple software, was underwhelming in terms of there was no big hot explosion release. They mostly were just showing off some, like, they're tidying things up. And I see them because they had a absolute catastrophic showing of their Apple AI, their Apple intelligence. And they kind of scrambled. They rolled back a lot of marketing. They rolled back a lot of product features. It was just a huge mess. Siri was like the excuse the term, the redheaded stepchild for the last year or so. They just didn't talk about it. It was a complete disaster. But this time they kind of circled back, and they had partnered with ChatGPT or with OpenAI, but now they're switching and they're partnering with Google Gemini, which has been a long, kind of weird, complicated relationship with Apple. One of Apple's biggest revenues is from Google to just make Chrome the default browser on the iPhone. So Apple relies on Google. They have a really long established relationship. So it kind of makes sense, especially as ChatGPT has been a little bit less guided. It's not as integrated in people's lives and products to the consumer. The average consumer is buying the iPhone quite as well as Gemini has been. So anyways, Apple is now integrating Gemini. So they're switching, they're tidying things up. They're trying to make small improvements, and they're focusing on the iPhone of hey, we fix this and we fix this and we fix this. So there is no big, huge push for AI. There's a lot of AI features, but there's no giant release of some extravagant software thing or update. And the way that I view that, I have to add the CEO thing just because who knows, it could be more related to that. And maybe I'm projecting too much, but I see, let's say the LLM, the model, the ChatGPT, the Claude, compare that to the web browser, right? There's no $1 billion web browser out there, maybe Chrome, but that's not how they make their money. You're not going to make $1 billion selling a web browser, but you need a web browser in order to make $1 billion off of a web service. So I think let's say this is in the 90s, because you used to pay Netscape used to cost, I think, $40 a month or something crazy. And that didn't work. That just wasn't a sustainable model. People just didn't see the value. It wasn't valuable enough to justify paying for it. But to this day, there is fortunes to be made on the other side of the browser. That's what I view LLMs as now. That's what I view generative technology. I think it is, right now it's cost preventative. When the costs really hit the door, really hit the consumer pocket and the enterprise pocket and the market, it's not going to be financially viable. I think it's likely it could become something that down the road becomes a utility that's subsidized by the U.S. government. I don't know even if it happens that way, but I see more of a fortune, and I think maybe iPhone or Apple is maybe seeing this, maybe just coincidentally, but I think there's going to be more money to be made in the way that you integrate an LLM into a product or a service, and then you sell that. So I think that iPhone is right to kind of scrap this idea that they're going to produce their own AI, but rather they're going to integrate Gemini very thoughtfully, the way that Apple always does, very thoughtfully into their products. And I mean, Apple has, the reason everyone has an iPhone, in my opinion, is because the user experience has always been, maybe not always, but originally was really user-friendly. And they had very thoughtful ways of going about how does this integrate into people's lives? How does your grandmother use an iPhone versus your grandmother using an Android? And that's been sort of their thing for a long time. And so I just see this as they're not trying to tackle the AI thing head on as like, we are the AI company, but rather we are the ones that put AI in your pocket. We are the ones that put AI in your life. Because I frankly, a lot of the, like, you go to chatgpt.com and you open up that browser, that is such a bland, unuser-friendly, that is such a corporate kind of interface. And it just, there's no way to integrate that into my life meaningfully, not with a bunch of other third-party buy-ins. So I'm losing my train of thought a little bit because I have so many sidebars. But Apple, I think, is potentially maybe going to be, in my mind, as I view it from my lens, going to be maybe an experiment to see, can there be more money to be made around the LLM than in the LLM? Now, that somewhat kind of depends on how successful these models are. I mean, do they stick around? Which ones will stick around? How will they be modified? Do they get more specialized? Because right now you have so much of a race to make a model that can do everything. It can do math and coding, and it can also talk to you like a therapist. But maybe it's cheaper or more cost effective to specialize these models into a way that it's like, I don't need that whole thing. I can use a much smaller, more refined or specific model that just fits right into my calendar app, and it just manages my calendar with my email and my text messages and communicates back and forth and acts as like a little agent that can't do my whole life. It's not my complete assistant, but it's my little assistant for, when I want to just make sure that I didn't double book myself in a text message conversation with my wife before I went and looked at the calendar. That is where I think people want to see artificial intelligence happen, at least in the state that it's in. I think right now it is too complicated. I think just in terms of it, like a lot of the times whenever I say, well, I find it can't do this, a lot of the response that I get from sort of AI boosters or people who are really bought into it is say, well, you have to work with it. And you have, well, I got to stop you there, because that's not how you get universal buy-in from a technology. You can't have to work with it. Like, the beauty of the iPhone or the iPad is that a 3-year-old can just pick it up and kind of intuitively know colors and pictures and touch. And that was the great thing about the touch screen. It was just very, very intuitive interface. And these LLMs do not have an intuitive interface. The way that you talk with them, the way that you ask for them, the fact that it's like you're having a big long text message, you're basically doing an email thread chain in order to get some information produced for you or yourself, or to get something created. There's got to be a better way to do that. And I think, me copying and pasting my calendar into chat and saying, hey, look at my calendar. And I know there's plugins and things that do this, but there's too many steps to get there. My point being is, I think if a company can focus more on how to, and Google, I know Gemini is doing this, but I don't think they're doing it meaningfully, because at the end of the day, they're still trying to sell their LLM that they are so deep in the hole on. But you take a company like Apple, who I'm sure is deep in the hole on their own stuff, but they've got real deep pockets. They're a big tech company. They could handle doing these kind of tests. But I think if they it can have the freedom of not having this burden of this giant model that they're trying to sell to the public and sell investors on. If they don't have that burden, maybe they could be more agile. You could also make the argument that Apple is the last company to do something like that, because they hate that 4-letter word risk, and they will put it off forever. But I feel very strongly, as Tim Cook steps out and the new guy steps in, I forget his name, for Apple. He was the original product guy. He's kind of back into products. Tim Cook, he really rose the ranks because he figured out how to basically manufacture iPhones in China. That's why he made $1 zillion himself and made iPhone a $4 trillion company. But he was never really a product guy, and that's what we all think of. Steve Jobs was a product guy. He was very focused on products. So we're kind of back in a new era of Apple. So I think it could happen. I think there's a lot of opportunity for it right now, and I had a lot of optimism about this last developers conference. So I've said a lot. I've gotten a lot off my chest. I needed to. There's still so much more that I'm sure I could talk about. I find these very exciting times, to quote The Matrix.
Very exciting time.